So I recently had the opportunity to attend an event that was hosted at a church that is quite different from what I'm used to in my own church. Ironically, it happens to be the church where I was baptized and is the church of my grandparents and ancestors, as far as I know. But not where I find myself since my conversion as an adult to Christianity. And to be honest, I always find it interesting to be something of a tourist in another denomination, to see how other Christians approach the mysteries of the faith and the things they emphasize. And in the case of this particular branch of Christianity, the overwhelming theme of their message is inclusion, welcome, and tolerance. This is the kind of church in which rainbow flags will greet you long before any of the traditional symbols of Christianity will. And front and center in this particular church was a piece of artwork that is probably the most succinct summary of their creed in visual form. It featured, of course, a rainbow, as well as an array of books and symbols which I expect represented various religious traditions, and then a tapestry of people with diverse physical traits, all holding hands in an embrace of peace, goodwill, and perhaps most of all, inclusion. Again, inclusion and welcome are ranked as their summum bonum, or their highest good in anything they seem to say about themselves. And while it's a bit, heavy-handed in its sentimentalism, I can understand why some people find the vision depicted in that painting appealing. I mean, what's not to like about a vision of the world in which everyone is included and welcomed and embraced, in which peace reigns supreme, in which arbitrary distinctions are overlooked and overcome, where everyone just gets along? And again, in order to achieve that vision, they've made welcome and inclusion their highest ideal that conditions everything else, even the confession of their own identity as Christians. That becomes secondary if it can be perceived as exclusive to anyone, which of course it can. But this raises an important question. Is it possible to be unconditionally inclusive and welcoming? Because every creed, every culture, if it wants to say anything about what we ought to do, as in ethics, it has to have a hierarchy of moral beliefs or moral goods that condition other goods. For example, it's good to seek comfort. It's also good to seek health. But what do you do when your comfort is compromising your health because of lazy habits or bad nutrition? In that case, health emerges as a higher good, which conditions your comfort. Another example might be competing interests of loyalty and truth. It's good to be loyal to people you love, or especially those you care for, but what happens when you're asked to lie for someone in order to remain loyal to them? In that case, truth and justice have to outrank loyalty. So health conditions comfort and truth conditions loyalty. And the more you make these kinds of comparisons, a hierarchy of goods that are the fundamental ones, which are unconditioned, should start to emerge. And for this particular church and many like it, I expect that inclusion and welcome achieves the rank of this kind of unconditioned good, so that any good which becomes a rival to inclusion is outranked and compromised by it. So if the truth makes someone feel unwelcome, then inclusion is given priority. If justice makes someone feel unwelcome, then justice has to be compromised. But the problem is, the longer you allow inclusion and welcome to take the highest position of moral priority, the less you have to include anyone in. Because this ultimately raises a question: what are you including people in? What is it that you're welcoming them to? Because if there isn't a community or an activity or a culture to include them in, then there won't be any inclusion. But that's the problem. As soon as you start to define anything, as soon as you start to articulate who and what you are, some people will feel excluded by that. So for example, in the case of a church, a common priority should be something like a physical building where you gather. But as soon as you make any decision about that, it's going to be in a physical location that is more inclusive to some people than it is to others. But as we've already established, inclusion conditions all other considerations. Therefore, the need for a building will always be outranked and then compromised. What about the beliefs of your community? In the case of a church, or the church that I mentioned earlier, they have all kinds of moral positions, things they stand for and things that they stand against that actually exist in the world. But if you're welcoming of everyone without condition, how can you be against anything? And what if I disagree with any of those moral positions? That would mean I'm not included, and yet inclusion has to take priority over everything else. So we have to compromise all of those moral statements in the name of inclusion. And if you keep going through this exercise and allow it to touch all the aspects of your identity and what defines you, what you end up with is nothing. The thing we were trying to include people in is extinguished by the priority of inclusion, which ends up abolishing inclusion itself. Like, what if a military made inclusion its highest priority? Well, what if I'm a pacifist and then I said, hey, I don't feel included in the military, but I want to be, therefore you have to become pacifist in order to make me feel welcome. If inclusion is their highest ideal, they have to accommodate this demand for inclusion. But if they do, then they're no longer a fighting military and have destroyed the very thing I wanted to be included in. Not to mention that it's become exclusive to non-pacifists. And it isn't like people haven't noticed the weaponized potential of this kind of ethical self-destruction and inconsistency, especially as a tool for exploiting the church. If the Christian creed has to take a lower rank to the imperative of inclusion, then the Christian creed is lost in the process. And without the Christian creed giving the church its substance, its identity, making it what it is, it becomes nothing, or at least something other than a church. And as a result, people who want to see the church destroyed or erased, which have existed since it began, they can easily invoke the demands of inclusion to wear away at Christian doctrine until it becomes just an empty husk of its former self. And sadly, that's what many historic churches have become. The soul of the thing is lost, and all that is left is a corpse that people are wearing and claiming that it's still alive. And because unconditioned inclusion can only lead to the suicide of the object of inclusion, when push comes to shove, these churches and other community organizations that say they are all about inclusion, when you really press them, they have to expose the lie that they actually aren't. The reality is, they discriminate as much as anything else. And in fact, I'd argue much more. For example, if I believe that sexuality has ends, that it follows a teleology of purpose, and that based on that, you can know what sexual practices are good and ordered towards those ends and which are bad and disordered. If I were to say that, then I won't be welcomed at that church. And the crazy thing is, my understanding of sexuality is the one that has been held by the vast majority of people from all kinds of places and cultures. It's by far the majority of view. But the one represented by the flags that are flown at these venues is actually a tiny, exclusive minority view when compared to the scope of all human cultures and civilizations. But then they have the audacity to claim that their beliefs are the most inclusive. So once again, the doctrine of inclusion simply becomes another means of exclusion and self-destruction. And that's what's happened to these churches. They've completely collapsed and imploded demographically. And if we return to that devotional image that hangs prominently in the church I visited, what we really find is that in spite of what it claims to be, it's actually just a Trojan horse. It claims to be good, it claims to be a gift, it claims to be affirmative, but hidden inside it is a kind of malice that leads to the violent destruction of anyone who tries to adopt it. Inclusion, peace, abolishing unjust discrimination, these are good things, admirable things, but the ideologies that are smuggled into these sentiments, in this case, are the furthest thing from inclusion, peace, and non-discrimination. If I tried going to a pride event in the hopes of having a peaceful discussion about different ideas about sexuality, I expect I'd be violently expelled. If I tried going to a workshop on intersectionality, I'd quickly find myself cast as an antagonist to the oppressed for simply having been born in this body. If I tried to get hired at some of these organizations, I expect I'd be discriminated against for being a white male. In fact, we saw this kind of discrimination in full splendor at the recent NDP leadership convention here in Canada, which went somewhat viral on the internet around the world. And so if you don't know, the NDP is the Socialist Party of Canada, and they were hosting a convention to pick a new party leader somewhat recently. And at the convention, they had microphones set up for delegates to discuss various policy resolutions. This is kind of standard practice for Canadian parliamentary party conventions. But to be more inclusive, at the NDP one, they had implemented the use of what they called equity cards, so that if you met certain profile qualities, you were given privileged position in the line to have your voice heard more prominently. The qualities in question related to your sex, your gender identity, your skin color, ethnicity, and any other category that historically we were always told not to judge people by. But here's the party of welcome and inclusivity officially discriminating against people based on every form of historical bigotry. And it isn't self-contained within their own strange inner world. Anyone who's worked at a company with DEI policies has experienced this firsthand. It's a policy of becoming more inclusive by insisting that everyone adopt monolithic, uniform political and ethical beliefs or face exclusion from their employment. Just on the face of it, that's the worst kind of unjust discrimination imaginable, all in the name of non-discrimination. This is what happens when your hierarchy of values becomes disordered. You end up cannibalizing yourself. The reality is, the church has always been maximally inclusive. It's a universal covenant open to anyone who wants to believe in Christ's teachings and place their lives in a pattern according to those teachings. Nobody who wants to follow Jesus and his teachings will be refused admission. But if people who don't want to be a part of the church based on what it is and what it believes, then they are excluding themselves. And no amount of compromise in the name of inclusion can fix that. The reality is, inclusion must be conditioned by truth, by justice, by faith, and by love. As soon as it outranks those moral goods, then the whole thing collapses, and there's nothing left to be included in. And ultimately, you can't force people to be included in something. People will always have the ability to choose to include themselves or exclude themselves from something based on what it is. When I joined the church, I made sacrifices. I had to compromise in order to conform myself to the church, to that greater community, which is what I wanted anyways. When I joined, it was because I recognized my own need for direction and salvation, which presupposes I'm going to have to give up aspects of how I lived my life prior to that. If people want to be included in the church without sacrificing their old life, then they don't want to be included in the church. It's a contradiction in terms. They want to be celebrated by the church. But that's entirely contrary to what it means to follow Christ. To become the least, to be humble and meek, to be contrite, to forsake this life for the promise of the next, that's what it means to follow Jesus. Pride isn't just a catchphrase to these people. They really are motivated by pride. They can't humble themselves. They can't be contrite. But they also can't tolerate anyone else out there not showing them the honor that they show themselves. That's what pride does. It starts with a lie about your own inflated sense of self-worth, and unless everyone else repeats the lie back to you, then it becomes jeopardized by its own fragility. So it isn't just enough that they are free to live their lives how they want. They want the church to also endorse the lies they tell themselves about themselves. And if it doesn't, they cry foul for discrimination and intolerance. Truth conditions inclusion. Justice conditions inclusion. And in the case of the church, faith and love condition inclusion. For any church to allow inclusion to supplant any of those other goods is the voluntary suicide of that church. And sadly, that's what we're seeing in many long-standing historic denominations. Hey, thanks for watching that. If you found that clip edifying or beneficial, I would ask you to consider supporting this work by liking, subscribing, commenting. All those things really help in the algorithm. Praying, or by joining our community over on Locals, where you get exclusive opportunities to interact with myself and others, and exclusive content. We're also running a monthly hangout studying philosophy and theology together. So if that interests you, head over to brianholdsworth.ca/help or click the QR code on the screen.